All right, so for those of you who watch this, you know how insanely athletic this knockout was from Vinicius Oliveira. Okay, and poor Sopaj, he just caught her right in the chin. Okay, so we're going to start with when his foot plants on the ground. Okay, we've talked about this before in several of my videos, and I've even got a video dedicated to it, so I'm going to kind of just briefly talk about it when it comes to the calf and the hip, and then you can go back and watch that video if you want to know a little bit more about it. But essentially, whenever we plant the foot in the muscles of the calf, that plantar flex, so like the gastroc and the soleus, we call it the gastroc-soleus complex. When we accept our weight, the muscles of the calf are actually getting longer, and that elongation of the muscle is called an eccentric load. So it's getting longer as it produces force, and then as you press up, it's a concentric force. That switch is called the amortization phase. The quicker that switch, the more powerful that concentric contraction can be, where the muscle is shortening while it's producing force. Okay, so it allows him to get really high. People who can jump really high and kick really fast and throw really hard punches, a lot of times have taken advantage of that stretch reflex really well. So let's move up to the hip. So in particular, a muscle called the rectus femoris. And the reason I say that is because it crosses the hip and the knee. So it's also taking advantage of that stretch reflex. Okay, so what it does is it flexes the hip, so it brings the hip up, but it also extends the knee. And it's not doing that here, but because the knee is flexing as he comes through, but it's put on a massive stretch here. So again, eccentrically elongating, and then it switches from that eccentric to the concentric via the amortization phase, and then it shortens to flex the hip. Okay, so just before that, I want to talk about what's happening at the other leg. So he's doing a really good job of making sure that his other leg is extending while he flexes. All right, so that's that very slight amount of lumbopelvic rotation actually helps him generate a little force here, along with the fact that whenever he makes contact, he's got really nice trunk flexion along with his cervical spine. Okay, we see that a lot. We broke down Rod Tang versus Superlek. We saw that with really good round kick from Superlek. He's got that cervical flexion, that trunk flexion, and then hip flexion as they whip around and use that momentum to generate more force. So he makes contact, and I want to talk a little bit about something called the length-tension relationship. And I'm not going to go in depth. Let me know if you want to talk about it a little bit more in the comments, but there's a relationship between the length of the muscle and how much force it can produce. It's called the sarcomere. So that sarcomere length and something called actin and myosin, they overlap and produce force. Is how a muscle contracts. But it says essentially that the more overlap they have, which tends to be around, if you pay attention, I want you to shift your attention here to the hip. Notice that this is 0 degrees, so there's a straight line relative to his torso. When he brings it up, we'll say that it's probably, 110, 115 degrees there relative to his torso, a little bit over 90 degrees. So if that's probably not his full amount of hip flexion, but if we just assume that it is, we'll say it's 120, the length-tension relationship would suggest that he's producing the most force around 60 degrees. So if we're being very nitpicky, okay, so we don't need to be because this was insanely effective and an amazing knockout, but if we're being really nitpicky, and this is not something that he should have done, this is just something that is happening, or if it would have happened, maybe it would have generated enough force. I'm not saying that he needs to work on this or whatever, but if he had made contact here, at about halfway of the muscles that flex the hip, like the rectus femoris and the psoas, and then you even had the TFL, even though it's off to the side a little bit, those muscles may have been able to generate enough more force through the contact in Sopaj's face. But he uses his momentum of his center of mass moving up and forward to make contact really well, right on the button, and then, as we know, that just folded him. I mean, this was an amazing knockout here.